Well, thank you all. Pleasure to be here. I hope you had an opportunity to grab one of those Islamic pancakes. I thought it was quite an innovation. I want to talk a little this morning about sort of the spiritual history of the Shakers. Central New York, this whole area, has been home to a wide variety of religious schismatic groups and social utopian experiments. And we've had so much evangelical activity that after the Second Great Awakening, the whole western part of New York State was designated the burned-over district. This is just to the west of us, from the west shore of Lake Cayuga all the way to Lake Erie. It was called the burned-over district because there was presumably no more fuel left. The fuel, of course, being unconverted souls. In a sense, this area was a spiritual alchemist's cauldron. We produced, among others, Mormons, spiritualism, Seventh-day Adventism, the Utopian Oneida Society, and right here in Montville, in 1843, our very own Utopian Society for the Society for Universal Inquiry and Reform, or the Skaneateles community. It was also known as the No God Society. The local No Gods imploded after a few years, presumably due to human nature conflicting with utopian ideals. All that's left of that society is a few buildings. Today we'll take a look at the Shakers. The Shakers are another spiritual group that found its home in central New York. But the root of the Shakers really begins in France in the late 1600s. And knowing the background will help us understand the Shakers a little bit better. Gustav is working on some issues which I think may cover the real history of the Shakers. But today I want to follow just one theme that fascinates me. Luther, Calvin, and Hus invented Protestantism in the early 1500s. It met with aggressive resistance from the established Catholic Church. Very Catholic France gave them some rights, but even the little tolerance shown to the French Protestants, the Huguenots, was withdrawn under Louis XIV. A charismatic group of Huguenots called Camisards were known as the French prophets, since they often experienced the movement of the Spirit. Things got pretty rough in Protestant France. Protestants were arrested, turned into galley slaves, massacred by the village load, and even deported to America. Sounds pretty much like parts of the world today. The Camisards thought the persecutions they were going through were divine punishment, a judgment on an ungodly people. How often the victim blames himself. Finally fed up, the Camisards took off for England. The Camisards were popular speakers in England, which was full of sects at that time, maybe because of their anti-French attitude. Around this time, the early 1700s, the European Great Awakening began. Protestantism, the Church of England, Presbyterians and the like, had gotten themselves all wrapped up in politics, hierarchy, and rituals after just a few hundred years. The revival movement was a pushback against the way Protestants had bound up religion in ceremony and rules. Evangelical preaching shook up the traditional Protestant churches. And these revivalist preachers woke people up to the authentic movement of the Spirit. The experience of feeling this movement of the Spirit and the power of faith. Sort of like today's evangelicals. This revival, though, was aimed directly at Christians sleeping in the pews, not the unchurched. The European Great Awakening reshaped the Congregational and Presbyterian churches, and it fanned the flame for the sort of upcoming Methodists and Baptists. Now, this is all background for the Shakers. The Shakers started as a sect of the Quakers. The Society of Friends was founded in England in the mid-1650s. Quakers were dissenters from the Church of England. They believed that the individual could directly know Jesus without the need of a church or a priest. And they experienced the mystery and movement of the Spirit. The name Quaker actually comes from a worship practice that began in the 1740s, a movement of the Spirit that led to worshipers physically trembling and quaking. Some French Camisards, the activist French prophets, joined up with these Quakers, and the charismatic Camisards added to the Quakers a new level of spirit in worship. Bingo! A volatile mix. Quaking and trembling becomes complete physicality. The charismatic Quakers split off from the mainstream Quakers. Their leaders were John Wardley and her husband Jane Wardley, excuse me. They did silent meditations, as did the mainstream Quakers. But silent meditation was broken by Mother Jane speaking out in prophetic revelation and trembling and dancing in the Spirit. Charisma broke out all over. A woman named Ann Lee joined this group of ex-Quakers, then known as the Wardley Society. Anne had been pressured by her blacksmith father into marrying his apprentice, and she was not a happy woman. 4 children died in infancy. She had always wanted to be celibate from the get-go, but echoing the concerns of the Camisards about possible divine judgment, she felt she had received judgment for her sinful human nature. Ann Lee vowed a life of sexual abstinence and self-abasement, shame. We're not sure how her husband took this. Ann Lee fasted, went sleepless, and finally feeling cleansed of her humanity, had a spiritual rebirth. And thus were the Shakers born. We do not know whether her husband joined the movement. The Shaker meetings in England started in silent contemplation, and with the moving of the Spirit, often became a bit wild. That was not enough. Shakers would barge into traditional Protestant services to let them know about their sexual sinfulness and other spiritual crimes. No surprise, Ann Lee was jailed for disturbing the peace. One time, while sitting in a cell, she received an important revelation. She was the female manifestation of Jesus. She was the second coming. Ann Lee now became Mother Ann. In 1772, Mother Ann received a further revelation to go to America, which she and 8 other believers did. Thus, the Shakers came to New York City, and like immigrants since, they worked, saved, and finally moved upstate, near Albany. They called themselves the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, or for short, the Believers. But they became known as the Shaking Quakers, or just Shakers. The Shakers were celibate. Without family or home, they had considerable energy to pour into their work. The mix of energy and the belief that God was in the details led them to work not only with great energy, but precision and great skill. And this grace led the Shakers to be not only skillful, but to be innovative. The Shakers were innovative even in governance. Their leadership was sexually egalitarian. Each Shaker community was governed by 2 Shaker men and 2 Shaker women. The Shakers were highly inventive and brought many useful innovations into the American culture. Some patented and some not. They essentially invented the packaged seed business. They're credited with inventing, among other things, the circular saw, an innovative metal for bushings, the clothespin, chair rails, a washing machine, a cheese press, and even the flat broom. Their seeds in envelopes became a big business, and we enjoy this industry today. Their architecture was plain, simple, without gewgaws, and extremely functional, as were the Shakers themselves. Their now classic furniture style probably influenced the American arts and crafts movement, and the Stickney factory owes the Shakers at least a nod. The Shakers exchanged spirit gifts, some of which remain as lovely artifacts. Dance was a major part of Shaker worship. Their worship dancing was social and group, not paired. It was as formal in its construction as American square dancing or European court dances. The square order shuffle, for example, which could be danced to simple gifts, might feature singers standing to the side and the dancers following a traveling gender gap formation. This featured lines of men and lines of women moving counterclockwise and maintaining constant distance between them. The singers were instructed to keep pace with the dancers. And that's important, as the pace of the dance intentionally changed as it went on. The simple, repetitive music was important. And precision of steps was important. Feet were placed heel to toe, and there was even a specific foot movement called a tip-tap. We're used to the Lord of the Dance sung as a slow hymn, but Simple Gifts, which is the tune, was sung and danced at a different pace than the stately hymn that we're used to. They would start slow with formalized steps, and then as the words, the steps, the movements were repeated, move at a faster and faster march pace, accompanied by the correct but increasingly fast and more vigorous body gestures and hand movements, hand shaking with hands and body bending up and down, shaking away the carnal sins. Shake, shake, shake away. Shake away the carnal. And then, with palms upraised, gathering in the blessings. As the dance progressed, the speed of the words, the music, and the steps increased until towards the end, there was an ecstatic jumble of motion and sound as body and mind yielded to the movement of the Spirit. Sort of a mix of an Assembly of God charismatic prayer service and the wild conclusion of the hora at a Jewish wedding reception. The Shakers seem unique. They certainly look different from any religious group we're familiar with. But haven't we seen similar reactions to traditional religions before? Let's see. The Shakers were distinguished by the pursuit of ideal purity rather than by any special code of doctrines. There were isolated communities of believers which were regulated by strict rules, sort of like monasteries. All things were held in common, without distinction of property. Special provision was made for the relief of the poor. Self-denial, celibacy, temperance, and labor, especially agriculture, were the outward life of the group. Purity and divine communion were their goals. Slavery and war were forbidden. Shakers? Yes. Who else? Essenes. Essenes. The Essenes probably took more ritual baths than ritual dances. You know, the group that was alive at the time of Jesus. And engaged in writing things like the Dead Sea Scrolls rather than marketing seeds in envelope packets. But aside from that, the Essenes, 2,000 years earlier, had much in common with the Shakers. The Shakers, like the Essenes, were ordinary people who, in faith, chose to give up their families, property, and worldly goods, and in whom the Spirit was encouraged to move, unquenched. The name Shaker comes from their ecstatic and ritualized dancing and symbolic shaking off of sins. The name Essenes is likely from the Greek asia, healers, which Josephus tells us the Essenes specialized in, using herbs and incantations. Both groups were probably regarded as beyond the fringe by their contemporaries. Each was millennialist. Each believed the time of great tribulation and the end times were near. As millennialists, the Shakers were unified in the belief that Christ had come again in the person of Mother Ann Lee. But the Shakers spoke of yet a second Messiah. They believe this second Messiah is each individual believer. They feel we are in the millennium, and it is the duty of each believer to live purely in the kingdom come and strive for perfection in everything he or she does. As I looked at the history of the Shakers, it brought to mind the central drama of our times: politics and certainty versus faith and mystery. We treat these as either or trade-offs, either one or the other. You can feel this conflict in your own life, in the way, for example, while going about our practical routines at work, we can get caught up in a moment of the transcendent. Or when we pray, we often find ourselves thinking, I wonder what's for dinner tonight. Jesus often points to a child as the example of how to enter the kingdom. I think that's because the child has an equal need for rules and certainty on the one hand, and the need for faith and mystery on the other hand. Children are hungry for mystery and wonder. If a child is lucky, this capacity for faith and mystery survives our structured childhood, plus the rigid socialization process of 16 to 20 years of schooling, often followed by the rituals of corporate life. Too often we try to eliminate fantasy and mystery so we can live in the real world. We're all born with a capacity for awe and astonishment. Do you remember the moment when involvement in politics, practical economics, and the need for certainty crowded out your childlike hunger for the invisible, the mysterious, and the spiritual? The Shakers were not a moderate group, but in their own way, they were an interesting balance of mysticism and practicality. The Shakers obviously didn't procreate their rights. Membership was by adoption of foundlings or through proselytizing. But the obvious dwindling of numbers was not seen as a problem. In fact, they believed that when the number of Shakers gets small enough, this will be the end time. Crazy? I don't know. There's an ancient Jewish tradition of the Lamed Vav. There are 36 Lamed Vavniks, 36 righteous persons alive in every generation, on the strength of whose faith and righteousness the whole world is kept from total destruction. The 36 are hidden. Even they themselves do not know who they are. Maybe some are Shakers. At the turn of the 19th century, a second Great Awakening hit America. This one, though, was aimed at converting the unchurched. This was the revival that produced the burned-over district in New York. The impact of this second Great Awakening is still felt in our area. Skaneateles is surrounded by revivalist evangelical churches. Even a healthy mainline church like our own loses members to revivalist churches. Like the Shakers, these evangelical churches preach revival and forgiveness, release from the power of sin, and an openness to the moving of the Spirit. Although the Shakers have dwindled away to a few women living in Maine, the same spark is still glowing in the burned-over district and elsewhere. So that's a look at the Shakers, and open to your comments or questions. A little bit different than what you thought.
You said there's still women living in Maine, so Shakers.
At its peak, in the mid-19th century, there were 6,000 Shaker believers. By 1920, there were only 12 communities left in the United States. Today, there is only one active Shaker village, Sabbath Day Lake Shaker Village in Maine. The other Shaker settlements are now essentially museums, like Hancock Shaker Village in Massachusetts. So perhaps when these 3 or 4 women die, something amazing will happen. It certainly has been happening in the lives of all those others who have gone on to a different experience. Traditional views of the Shakers emphasize the practical, and we're uncomfortable talking about the ecstatic, which is what I tried to introduce you to today. There was this powerful movement of the ecstatic mystery of the Spirit that led him, and they had ritualized ways of expressing it and then gave into it. The rituals, the formalized ways, were just an introduction, a way to open themselves to the Spirit, and they let the Spirit move. Probably even both the Old and the New Testament was less sanitized than we like to picture it. Religion was probably a lot messier than we think of it today. Not just the slaughtering of animals, but the ecstatic movement. Just picture what was going on with John the Baptist and his group.
Do you know if there were any break-offs in the Shakers that had started some other evangelical types of churches that got started in America?
I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm wondering if,
It's a good question. Certainly the movement of the Spirit has led to a lot of fringe, independent, we call them fringe because they're not mainline, but there's a lot of them.
Right.
Independent churches, some of which have gathered together, some of which remain independent, but the Spirit is moving. We don't acknowledge that it's moving in uncontrolled ways. No doubt the Spirit moves here in this church, through music, through other ways, through prayer. But this ecstatic movement is something that people hunger for.
Did any of them ever go back to their Quaker beginnings? And did Quakers ever recognize that and take any of their actions into their Quaker meetings as begun? No more talking, no more fun.
The only thing I did learn is that the Quakers now sing, which they didn't used to do. So it could be that there's some of this movement fed back. But even the Quakers had trembling in movement of the Spirit, which I think they were uncomfortable with. We're always
Do you know what the relative percentage of Shakers and Quakers were in the Skaneateles community?
There were none in the Skaneateles community. This was a utopia, a no-God utopia. This was there were many utopias formed up. Utopia means nowhere. I mean, Thomas More was the first one to use that name, utopia, which literally means no place. The utopian movement here was literally called a no-God movement. So if there were Shakers or Quakers, they were ex-Shakers or Quakers who were Christians. These people literally did not believe in God, which was one of the things that distinguished them. And from what I understand, the reason the group came apart was because of quarrels about who owned what, and ownership, and sexual issues about favoritism, and so forth. The normal things.
Well, within any given area, there's a head count of people.
Oh, in the area.
So what would be like the percentage of them to the overall area? Like, that's no question.
Well, in their peak, there were only 6,000. Excuse me, yeah, 6,000 believers. So it was always very small. We remember the Shakers because of the, I think, great skill, innovativeness, and the impact of their inventions on the culture. Every time we use a flat broom, or think about a chair rail, or look at arts and crafts furniture, think about the Shakers.
100 years ago in my life, I was introduced to the Free Methodist Church. And this this kind of reminds me of it. There were many rules and regulations, you couldn't wear long sleeves, and you couldn't dance, you didn't drink, and all that kind of stuff. And you went to camp meetings in the Jamestown area. And I was young enough to be scared out of my wits. But they could get going. They could get going there. So I don't know, John, if that's, an offshoot. But it's not a Methodist church, it's a Praying Methodist church, and you free yourself home. It is praise the Lord.
I'm not sure of the progression, which I think was the specific question of how each one led to each. It was the movement of the Spirit that led to all of them. The Shakers were just one of the manifestations of the very broad movement of the Spirit in the culture. Methodism itself, that flame that they use as their symbol, was a sign of the original Methodism, which then, it's a constant thesis, antithesis, synthesis. You get very rule-bound, it gets broken with great charisma, no, we need more order. So, and every church has the same issue. I think, Craig, you second that. There's no one right way to do this. You need to, at the same time, have a society, a community with some rules and organization. You also need to have enough airspace for the Spirit to move. It's difficult sometimes because people want certainty when the Spirit wants uncertainty. And faith is the opposite of certainty. If we knew, we wouldn't need faith.
This ecstaticism that you refer to as sort of the Spirit taking over, was that something that just generated at a specific time in history, or was it something that's existed throughout history by some portion of the populations?
We know that David's wife, Michal, was embarrassed when David whirled in ecstasy, dancing before the Lord as the ark was led into the temple in the year 1000 BC. So we know that at least for 3,000 years it's been moving. And we see the movement of the Spirit happening all through scriptures, but it's sanitized for us. Saul was among the prophets. There are just so many references to it. It's the dancing in the Spirit, moving in the Spirit, prophesying. Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher in the 12th century, described 11 degrees of prophecy, different levels at which the Spirit would move. The lowest level being the kind of prophetic writing that David did in the Psalms. The highest level being Moses seeing God. So there are many levels of the Spirit moving, and there have been many people who've written about this throughout history. In our culture, we tend to ignore it, or just be uncomfortable with it. We like order, we like certainty. But it's always been here. And I think when things get stuffy enough, and maybe that's why the Protestant Reformation happened in the first place, First Reformation. I think God knows it's time to move, to break things up a bit and get folks out of their belief in certainty and out of the rules. As Jesus said to the rich young man, just being not bad is not good enough. There's more to it than following the 10 Commandments. That's openers.
I'd be interested in hearing what books you use in terms of your research, and also to mention if people want to go a little deeper into the Shakers, there's a wonderful book that was written about 20 years ago by a man named Stephen Stein, just the way it sounds, that was published by, I think, Indiana Press, and it's called The Shakers. And it's got graphs and charts and photographs and maps, everything. And subsequently, a book that I've only read a little bit of. Is called God Among the Shakers. It's about a woman from New England who goes to live with the Shakers in Maine and discover their spirituality.
I will confess to being very shallow in my research. I love to use the internet. I don't believe any one thing, so I look at a lot of different comments and a lot of different sources and sort of piece together myself what I think that was about that seems to be common across them. So I've not lifted this from any one source. This is multiple sources that I've sort of put together. So this is not a scholarly talk I've done for you. It's probably not wrong, but it's...
I grew up in Soda Point, like an hour from here toward Rochester, and there's a Shaker Settlement there. I grew up in Soda Point, it's about an hour from here, and there's a place on Lisa Farm, so that was a Shaker Settlement.
Yeah, I think there are a few still around, but they're mainly sort of museums. They're not really alive at this point.
Larry, you talked about the burned out area just west of us. The Mormons came from that burned out area, seeking a new,
There's something about, I don't know whether it's the water in the lakes, but there's something about this area that makes it the home for innovative thought in society and religion for experimentation. This is, you're living on sacred ground here.
In the back of my mind, I'm thinking I read something recently that said that the local Lutheran church had been a Shaker meeting house at one time.
It was a Quaker meeting house.
It was a what?
Quaker.
A Quaker, yeah.
It was moved across the lake by a team of oxen
Okay.
In the winter.
in the winter. The oxen did not walk on water.
Shakers and I would walk. Yeah, so we're in the middle of it. And if there's one thing you've learned from the long, being a Jew, history to me is today. You live in the past and future is all sort of a block universe. There isn't past and future, all it is, just less probability out in front. This is, it's still going on. That within each of you, there is still a rebirth happening. There's faith being born in ways that will express itself in some way or another. We don't know. That things happen at a different pace than we think. They don't happen in a straight line, the way history likes to describe it. So there's always the excitement of what's going to happen at the end of today, or during the day, never mind next week. It's just all an experiment and all exciting. I just enjoy life so much, and I enjoy the little problems that are given to me to come up with something to entertain you or give you information about. And I thank you so much for allowing me to do this with you.